A simple ranch life turns into a deep love story, cowboy romance, cowboy secrets. The morning Rhett Calloway first arrived at Holt Ranch, Cadden was standing knee-deep in the creek behind the south pasture, boots soaking, hat tipped low against the June sun, trying very hard not to cry. He wasn't the kind of man who cried. 22 years of dust, hard leather, and his father's silence had burned most of that softness out of him. But the letter in his shirt pocket, the one from the bank, the one with words like final notice and foreclosure proceedings, had a weight to it that pressed against his ribs like a stone. He stood in that cold water and let the current pull at his ankles and told himself it was going to be fine, that he'd figure something out, that he always did. He didn't hear the truck until it rattled over the cattle guard at the far end of the property, a sound like loose teeth in a tin can. He turned slowly, shading his eyes. A beat-up blue Ford, sun-faded to something closer to gray, came rolling down the long dirt road between the fence lines. It moved like it wasn't sure it was welcome, like it might stop and turn around at any moment. Cadden waded out of the creek. He picked up his hat from the rock where he'd set it, put it back on, and walked toward the truck. The man who stepped out of that truck was not what Cadden expected. He'd hired a ranch hand through an online listing, posted it mostly out of desperation, honestly, because his father's back had given out for good in April and the two of them couldn't manage 500 acres alone anymore. He'd expected someone grizzled, someone with worn knuckles and a chew of tobacco in his cheek, someone who looked like the land. Rhett Calloway looked like he'd wandered in from somewhere else entirely. He was tall, not enormous, but tall in the way that made you notice it, with dark hair that curled slightly at the temples where the heat had gotten to it. He wore a plain white t-shirt, jeans with actual dirt on them, and boots that had seen real work. But there was something about his face, something open, something that hadn't been closed down yet by years of weather and worry. He had eyes that were somewhere between brown and amber, and when he looked at Cadden across the hood of that truck, he smiled like they were already friends. Cadden did not smile back, he crossed his arms instead. "You Cadden Holt," Rhett said, leaning his forearms on the truck's roof, easy as anything. "Depends," Cadden said, "you got references." Rhett blinked, then he laughed, short and genuine, not the kind of laugh that's trying to impress anyone. He reached into the cab and pulled out a folded piece of paper. Cadden walked over and took it without letting their fingers touch. He read it: 2 names, a cattle operation in New Mexico, a horse farm in Colorado, good signatures, real addresses. "Fair enough," Cadden said, folding it and tucking it in his back pocket. "You start tomorrow, bunkhouse is around back, meals are at 6, noon and 6. You miss a meal, you find your own food, you don't drink on the property, you don't make problems, you leave when the summer's done." "Yes, sir," Rhett said, and there wasn't a trace of sarcasm in it. Cadden turned and walked back toward the house. He told himself he hadn't noticed the way Rhett watched him go. He told himself it didn't matter, he had enough problems already. The first week was professional, barely. Rhett worked hard, Cadden had to give him that. He was up before dawn, out in the barn before Cadden's boots hit the porch boards. He wasn't careless with the animals, which was the first test. He didn't flinch from the ugly jobs, mucking stalls, hauling feed, mending fence line in the afternoon heat. He was quiet when Cadden needed quiet and asked the right questions when he needed to ask them. Cadden's father, Walt Holt, watched all of this from the kitchen window with the expression of a man recalculating something. Walt was 61, built low and square, with hands like wooden paddles and a voice that only got loud when he needed it to. He'd been using a cane since the disc surgery and it infuriated him every single day. "He's not bad," Walt said one evening as Cadden came in for supper. "He's fine," Cadden said, not looking up. "I'm just saying." "I know what you're saying, Dad." Walt set the cane against the wall with a little too much force. "I'm saying you could stand to be less frosty to the man, he's going to be here all summer." "I'm not frosty," Cadden said, "I'm professional." Walt snorted, "Son, there's professional and there's whatever you are." The boy looks at you like he's waiting to find out if you bite. Cadden poured himself a glass of water. "Good," he said, "that means he'll stay out of trouble." But staying out of trouble, Cadden was slowly realizing, wasn't something Rhett Calloway was built for, not the bad kind of trouble, just the persistent, friendly kind that wore you down over time the way water wears down rock. He found openings in Cadden's silence and slipped through them. It started with music. Rhett had a habit of humming while he worked, old country songs mostly, some stuff Cadden didn't recognize, and the humming drifted through the barn walls in the morning like something that belonged there. Cadden caught himself listening for it. He caught himself noticing when it stopped. It continued with questions, not personal ones, not at first, questions about the land. About the creek's history, about why the east pasture had a different grass than the west, about the old stone wall along the north property line that didn't seem to serve any purpose. They were the questions of someone genuinely curious, and Cadden, who had spent his whole life learning to read this land like a language, found himself answering before he decided to. "That wall was my grandfather's," Cadden said one afternoon, leaning on the fence post while Rhett mended a gap in the wire. "He built it when he first claimed the property. Didn't need to, really, just needed to do something with his hands while he figured out what kind of man he was going to be out here." Rhett looked up from the wire. What kind of man did he turn out to be? Cadden considered that a hard one, he said finally, but a fair one. The land respected him. "You can't make land respect you," Rhett said. "No," Cadden agreed quietly, "you can't." Rhett went back to the wire. Cadden stayed at the fence post. The wind moved through the high grass and the cicadas started up in the tree line, and neither of them said anything for a while. It was the kind of quiet that doesn't feel empty. It felt like something was being built in it. Cadden walked back to the barn and tried not to think about that. The third week of June brought a heat wave that sat on the land like a fist. The thermometer on the barn wall read 104 by noon, and the water troughs needed filling twice a day. The horses were restless and the cattle were slow-moving, and everybody's temper was shortened by about 3 inches. Cadden's shortened most of all, because in the middle of the heat wave the bank called. He took the call in the barn, away from the house, away from his father, crouched between 2 hay bales with the phone pressed hard against his ear, while a man in a suit voice explained to him in careful language what was going to happen to his family's land if he didn't make the next payment. The payment that was $4,000 more than he currently had. He sat there after the call for a long time. The hay smelled like everything he'd ever known. Outside, he could hear Rhett moving around the paddock, talking low to one of the horses the way he did sometimes when he thought nobody was listening. That low, easy voice. Cadden pressed the heels of his hands against his eyes and breathed. He didn't tell Rhett. He didn't tell his father either, not the full extent of it. He carried it the way he'd always carried things, silently, in the way his body moved, in the tightness of his jaw, in the wall that went back up around him after those brief moments it had started to come down. Rhett noticed, of course he noticed. "You eat today?" Rhett asked, coming into the barn that afternoon. "I'm fine," Cadden said. "That's not what I asked." Cadden looked at him. Rhett was leaning in the barn doorway, the light behind him making it hard to read his face clearly. He had a canteen in one hand. He held it out. "Drink at least," Rhett said. "It's 100 degrees." Cadden took the canteen. He drank. He handed it back. Their fingers brushed in the exchange, and Cadden's jaw tightened for a different reason than the one he'd been carrying all afternoon. "Thank you," he said, in the flat voice he used when he didn't want to say anything else. "You're welcome," Rhett said, in the quiet voice he used when he heard everything Cadden didn't say. That night there was a thunderstorm. It rolled in fast from the west, the way the worst ones always did, turning the sky green at the edges before the first crack of lightning. Cadden was on the roof of the equipment shed. There'd been a leak threatening the corner all season when the first drops hit. By the time he got down the ladder, it was pouring. He ran for the barn. The horses needed checking. They always went skittish in storms. Rhett was already there when Cadden pushed through the door, soaked to the skin, breathing hard. Rhett had lit the hanging lantern and was moving from stall to stall, low and calm, a hand on each horse's neck. Thunder cracked outside and the big bay juniper kicked the stall wall. "Easy," Rhett said. "Easy now, I got you." Cadden stood in the doorway dripping and watched him work. There was something about the way Rhett moved with animals, unhurried, certain, like he was made of something they could trust. Cadden had never seen it so clearly as he saw it right then, by lantern light, with the rain hammering the roof and the horses trembling. He moved to the other side of the barn and started on the stalls there. They worked through the storm without speaking much. When all 6 horses were settled and the lantern was burning steady between them, they both slumped against the center post at the same time on opposite sides of it. Cadden could feel the warmth coming off Rhett's back through the wood. "You were up on the roof," Rhett said. "There's a leak. In a storm. It doesn't leak when it's not raining." Rhett laughed, and Cadden heard it more than saw it, this low, rumbling sound that vibrated through the post between them. Against his better judgment, the corner of Cadden's mouth turned up. "You're something else," Rhett said, but gently, like it was a good thing. Cadden didn't answer, but he didn't move away either. They sat there back to back against that post while the storm exhausted itself outside. The horses settled, the rain gentled to a hiss. Cadden closed his eyes and let himself, just for those minutes, stop carrying everything. When he opened them again, he was aware of two things: that the storm was passing and that he didn't want to stand up yet. He stood up anyway. July arrived with a slower rhythm. The crisis of the heat wave had passed and the land had greened up a little from the storm rain. The hay baling was done and the cattle had been moved to summer pasture, and there was work still, always work, but the brutal pressure of June had eased into something more livable. Something had shifted between Cadden and Rhett, nothing that could be named, not exactly, but the silence between them had a different quality now. It had warmth in it. They fell into routines without planning to. Morning coffee before the day started, both of them on the porch steps because the kitchen felt too small at 5 in the morning. Cadden sat on the left, Rhett on the right, and they watched the sun come up over the east pasture and drank their coffee and talked about nothing important. What needed doing that day, whether the back fence could wait another week, whether the truck needed the oil changed before the next supply run. Nothing important, but Cadden found himself looking forward to it the way you look forward to the one solid thing in a day that might otherwise tilt. Rhett had a way of filling up a silence without breaking it. He'd read sometimes on those mornings paperback novels he kept in the bunkhouse, worn soft covers, pages creased from being read more than once. He didn't offer them to Cadden or talk about them. He just read. And sometimes he'd laugh quietly at something on the page, this private sound, and Cadden would glance over and then look quickly away. One morning Cadden looked over and didn't look away in time. Rhett had his head slightly bowed over the book, the morning light catching the angles of his face in a way that was almost architectural. There was a piece of dark hair fallen over his forehead. His coffee mug was balanced on his knee. He was completely absorbed. Cadden stared for what was definitely too long. Rhett looked up. Their eyes held for a beat, 2 beats, the kind of pause that happens before you fully understand what's happening. Then Cadden turned and looked at the east pasture and drank his coffee and said, in a voice that came out more level than he had any right to expect, "We need to check the salt blocks in the north paddock today." "Sure," Rhett said. His voice was normal, completely normal. But from the corner of his eye, Cadden saw him close the book and turn it face down on his knee. And in the silence that followed, neither of them spoke, but neither of them moved either, and the sun came up slow and golden over the east pasture like it was taking its time on purpose. The 4th of July fell on a Thursday that year. Holt Ranch had a tradition. It went back before Cadden's time, back to his grandfather's day, of a small gathering. Neighbors from the surrounding properties, a few families from the nearest town, which was a 40-minute drive down the county road. They set up folding tables in the yard, and there was food and cold drinks, and someone always brought a guitar, and the whole thing ran from late afternoon until the fireworks from the fairgrounds 12 miles away were barely visible on the horizon. It was, as traditions went, one that Cadden had always experienced with a kind of background discomfort. Gatherings meant performing. Performing meant people looked at you and asked how things were going, and you had to tell them fine. Things are fine, when the truth was that the bank letter was still in your sock drawer and the land you'd grown up on was quietly disappearing from under you. But he set up the tables. He helped Walt carry the coolers out. And at some point in the late afternoon he turned around and found Rhett in the yard wearing a clean blue flannel shirt, hair slightly tamed, helping Mrs. Garrity from the neighboring property carry a covered dish, and something in Cadden's chest made a small and alarming movement. The evening was warm and golden in the way July evenings get when they're trying to be remembered. Cadden moved through it carefully, speaking to everyone he needed to speak to, eating something he barely tasted. He kept finding Rhett in the crowd without looking for him. Rhett laughing at something one of the Garrity boys said. Rhett crouched down to talk to a small child who had gotten chocolate on her dress and seemed distressed about it. Rhett at the edge of the yard later, holding a cold drink and looking out at the dark horizon with an expression Cadden couldn't read from a distance. Cadden crossed the yard. He didn't plan to, his feet just took him there. He stood beside Rhett at the yard's edge. The voices of the gathering drifted behind them. Out ahead was the dark of the pasture and the blacker dark of the tree line, and above it all the stars, which out here were an embarrassment of riches, too many, too bright, too impossible to ignore. "Good night," Rhett said quietly. "It is," Cadden agreed. They were both looking at the sky. Their arms were almost touching. Cadden was aware of this with a clarity that felt slightly ridiculous. You ever leave, Rhett asked, this place, you ever think about going somewhere else? Cadden considered the question. No, he said, not really. Not even for a little while. This land is mine, Cadden said. The word mine felt complicated even as he said it, given the letter in the sock drawer, given the $4,000. It's mine whether I'm on it or not, so leaving doesn't, he stopped. It doesn't feel like an option I have. Rhett turned to look at him then. Cadden could feel it. He kept his eyes on the horizon. What if it became one, Rhett said, an option? Then I'd still stay, Cadden said, I'd choose it. The silence that followed had weight to it, the kind that's not asking for words to fill it. I think that's the bravest thing I've heard in a while, Rhett said quietly. Cadden finally turned to look at him. The lantern light from the yard threw warm shadows across Rhett's face. He was already looking at Cadden with that same open, undefended expression he'd arrived with, that expression that hadn't been closed down yet. Cadden became very aware of how close they were standing. He took a small, deliberate step back. Go enjoy the party, he said in a voice that came out quieter than he intended. You worked hard this month, you earned it. He went back inside before Rhett could answer. There is a particular cruelty to awareness. Once you are aware of a thing, once you have let yourself see it clearly, you cannot make yourself unsee it. You can look away. You can stay busy. You can be professional and efficient and emotionally impenetrable, but the awareness is there in the peripheral vision of your heart, patient and persistent. Cadden knew this. He'd known it once before, years ago, and had handled it by simply leaving, gone to stay with his aunt in Amarillo for 3 months, come back when the feeling had died from starvation. That strategy had worked because it was possible. This was not possible. He had a ranch to run and a man to pay and 500 acres that needed him. So he stayed, and the awareness stayed with him. He became careful, deliberately careful. He structured his days to create natural distance, sent Rhett to the far pastures when he worked near the barn, took the barn chores himself when Rhett was working the cattle. He reduced their morning porch time to a few minutes rather than the long, comfortable stretch it had become. He answered questions in fewer words. He stopped lingering after supper. Rhett noticed. How could he not? He didn't call it out, not directly, but Cadden could see it happening, something in Rhett's expression that flickered and recalibrated each time Cadden withdrew, like a man adjusting his footing on ground that kept shifting. He worked as hard as ever, said less, stopped humming. The barn felt emptier without the humming. Cadden noticed that too, and hated himself a little for noticing. Walt noticed as well because Walt, for all his silence and stiff manner, was the most perceptive man Cadden had ever known, and absolutely nothing got past him. What'd he do? Walt asked one evening. Nothing, Cadden said. You're frostier than you were in June, and I didn't think that was possible. I'm not frosty, Cadden said, I'm tired. You're running from something, Walt said, not harshly, just observationally, the way he'd always stated hard truths. And it's not the bank. Cadden put down his fork. Dad. I'm not asking, Walt said. I'm observing. There's a difference. He picked up his coffee. He's a good man, Cadden. I know he is, Cadden said. Sometimes that's the problem, Walt said, and left it there. The fracture point came on a Tuesday in mid-July, and it came from the direction Cadden least expected. A truck came down the road from the east, unfamiliar truck, Texas plates, a man Cadden didn't recognize who turned out to be named Porter Malone, a rancher from 2 counties over who'd heard about Holt Ranch's situation through the grapevine, the way things traveled in these communities, like water finding cracks. He was looking to purchase the east 40 acres, he said. He'd talked to the bank already. He was prepared to offer fair market value. He said all of this to Cadden on the porch steps while Rhett stood 20 feet away at the water trough, close enough to hear every word. Cadden kept his voice level through the entire conversation. He thanked Porter Malone for coming. He said he'd think about it. He said he appreciated the directness. He shook the man's hand and watched him drive away, and then stood on the porch for a moment that stretched too long. When he turned, Rhett was still at the water trough, but he wasn't pretending to do anything anymore. He was just standing there looking at Cadden with those amber-brown eyes, and on his face was an expression that was worse than pity. It was understanding. Deep, recognizing understanding. The kind that meant Rhett had already quietly figured out the full shape of something Cadden had never told him. Don't, Cadden said. Rhett's jaw moved slightly. I wasn't going to. I don't need anything from you right now, Cadden said, and it came out harder than he meant it to, sharp enough to land like something thrown. Just finish what you were doing." Rhett went very still, then he nodded once, turned and walked toward the barn without a word. Cadden went inside. He sat at the kitchen table and did not think about the East 40 acres. He thought about Rhett's face when he'd said that, the way it had closed, the way that open expression, the one that had been there since the first day that he'd told himself he wasn't relying on, had shuttered like a window in a wind. He'd put it there, he'd put that look on that man's face. He sat at the table for a long time. Then he got up, went to the barn, and opened the door. Rhett was in Juniper's stall, doing nothing in particular, just standing with one hand resting on the horse's neck the way he did when he needed to be somewhere quiet. He looked up when Cadden came in. "I'm sorry," Cadden said, "what I said was unfair." Rhett studied him. "Okay," he said. I don't talk about the money situation with anyone." "I didn't ask about it," Rhett said. "I wasn't going to." "I know," Cadden said, "I know that." He leaned against the stall door. The wood was warm from the day's heat. When you looked at me like that." "Like what?" Rhett said quietly. Cadden searched for the right word. "Like you already knew," he said. "It made me feel," he stopped. "Exposed," he finished, even quieter. Rhett's hand moved on Juniper's neck, slow and steady. "That wasn't my intention," he said. "I know it wasn't," Cadden said. He blew out a breath. "It's mine to carry, it's got nothing to do with you, and I made it about you, and that wasn't right." Rhett looked at him for a moment, then he stepped out of the stall and latched it behind him and stood in front of Cadden with about 4 feet of barn between them. "Can I say something?" he asked. "Sure." "You do that a lot," Rhett said. "Put up walls when someone gets too close to seeing the real thing. I've watched you do it all summer." His voice was calm, not accusatory, just honest. "I'm not trying to take anything from you, Cadden, he paused. "I'm not a threat." The word threaded through Cadden's chest like a needle. "I know you're not," he said. "Then stop treating me like one." They looked at each other across those 4 feet of barn, and the horses were quiet, and the barn smelled like hay and warm wood and something honest. Cadden felt seen in a way that was almost unbearable, and he stood there and let it happen because running had a cost he was no longer willing to pay. "All right," he said, "fair enough." The corner of Rhett's mouth moved, not quite a smile but something in that direction. "All right," Rhett echoed. Something loosened after that. Not all the way. Cadden was not made for the all-the-way loosening, not quickly anyway, but enough. Enough that the mornings on the porch stretched out again, enough that he answered questions in full sentences, enough that when Rhett laughed at something in those novels of his, Cadden didn't pretend not to notice. He started asking what Rhett was reading, just that, just the question. Rhett always told him. Sometimes he'd read a paragraph out loud, holding the book in one hand and his coffee in the other, voice unhurried in the early morning air. He read the same way he did everything, without performing it, without making it a thing, just doing it. Cadden listened and looked at the east pasture and kept his face neutral and thought things that had no safe harbor. The nights got harder. He wasn't sure when that had happened. When it had started being the case that the lying in the dark part of the day was the part he had to get through. He'd lie in his bed in the old farmhouse and listen to the quiet, the land's nighttime sounds, the occasional shift and breath of the horses, the far-off train, and somewhere in that quiet was the knowledge that Rhett was 30 yards away in the bunkhouse, and that knowledge pressed against the inside of Cadden's chest like it was trying to get out. He thought about the conversation in the barn. "I'm not a threat," the directness of it, the steadiness. He thought about the way Rhett moved through a day, that unhurried, certain quality, like a person who had made peace with themselves some time ago and didn't need the world to confirm it. He thought about his eyes by lantern light during the storm. He turned over in his bed and told himself to stop. He'd been telling himself to stop for weeks. It was working about as well as telling rain to stop. The crisis that brought everything closer together came on a Thursday morning at the end of July. Cadden was moving the cattle from the south pasture to the north when the fence on the east boundary gave way. He didn't know it had given way until he heard them, the cattle, already through the gap and into the roadside scrub, heading toward the county highway in that slow, inexorable way that cattle do when they've found freedom and aren't sure what to do with it but are firmly committed to finding out. He didn't have time to go back for Rhett. He pushed his horse into a hard run and went after them alone, trying to flank them, trying to turn them. But there were 23 head and one of him, and the highway was a quarter-mile away, and his heart was hammering. He heard Rhett's horse before he saw him. Then Rhett was there, coming around from the north in a controlled, fast arc, cutting off the lead cattle, turning them. They worked it like a machine without needing to communicate. Without wasted movement, Cadden turned the flank while Rhett drove the lead, and together they pushed the cattle back through the broken gap and into the field. When it was done, they sat their horses in the afternoon sun, both breathing harder than the horses were, and stared at each other across the gap in the fence. "How did you?" Cadden started. "Saw the dust from the north paddock," Rhett said, still catching his breath. "Figured it wasn't good." Cadden looked at him, sweat-damp hair, chest still moving fast, eyes alert. Something had shifted in Cadden's expression without his permission, and he didn't have the breath to rearrange it quickly enough. "Thank you," he said, and it came out rough. "That's what I'm here for," Rhett said. But the way he said it, the way his eyes held Cadden's for a breath too long, suggested he already knew they'd stopped talking about cattle. They fixed the fence together that afternoon. It was hot, close work, shoulder to shoulder in the scrub grass, posts and wire tools passed back and forth. Their hands were in the same space constantly, the way close work demanded. Once, when they were both pulling wire taut from opposite sides, their arms crossed and Rhett's forearm pressed warm against Cadden's for 3 full seconds before they both adjusted. Neither of them commented on it. But Cadden felt it for the rest of the afternoon like a brand. That evening after supper, Rhett came to the porch as usual, but instead of sitting on his step, he sat on Cadden's step. Not right next to him, there was space between them, but on the same step, like a declaration of something too subtle to challenge. Cadden looked at him. "I wanted to sit on this side," Rhett said, "better view of the west." The sun was, in fact, setting in a way that deserved an audience. Sheets of orange and deep red, the kind of display that felt almost overstated but wasn't, because the sky out here didn't know how to understate. "Fine," Cadden said. They watched the sunset. The space between them was about 14 inches. Cadden was aware of every inch of it. "You ever talk to anyone," Rhett asked after a while, "about any of it, the ranch, the money?" "I talked to the bank," Cadden said. "Not what I meant." A pause. "No," Cadden said, "not really." "Why not?" Cadden thought about it. "Because talking about it makes it more real," he said. "And if it's more real, it becomes, I don't know, something I might not be able to handle." "But you're handling it," Rhett said. "I'm managing it," Cadden said. "That's different." Rhett was quiet for a moment. "You could talk to me," he said. "I'm not going to fix it. I know I can't fix it, but a pause, "I'm here." The simplicity of that landed in Cadden's chest and stayed there. "I'm here," 2 words, barely anything, the most important thing anyone had said to him in a long time. "I know," Cadden said. His voice was very quiet. "Do you?" Rhett asked, and there was something careful in it, something that meant more than the land and the money. Cadden turned to look at him. Rhett was already looking at him. The sunset was doing dramatic things behind Rhett's shoulder, and Cadden wasn't looking at any of it. "I'm starting to," Cadden said. Rhett's expression did something slow and complicated. He nodded once. He looked back at the sunset. His shoulder was very close to Cadden's. They stayed there until the last color drained from the sky. August came in hot and golden and wrong. Wrong because of what arrived with it. A man named Garrison Drake. He drove up on a Saturday, a newer truck, a bigger one, and climbed out with the easy confidence of someone who'd never had to think about what they were going to say next because the whole world had always moved to accommodate them. He was tall, broad, handsome in a deliberate way, and he'd known Rhett in Colorado. That much was clear from the way Rhett went still when he saw him and then went very neutral, the way people do when they're managing something. "Garrison," Rhett said, just the name, no warmth. "Rhett." Garrison's voice was warm enough for both of them. He looked around the property like someone appraising a painting. "Nice place," he said. "It's not mine," Rhett said. "No, but you're here." Garrison's eyes moved to Cadden. He stuck out a hand. "Garrison Drake, old friend of Rhett's." "Cadden Holt," Cadden said and shook it. Garrison stayed for the afternoon. He and Rhett sat on the bunkhouse porch, and Cadden could see them from the barn, not the specifics, just the shapes of them, the body language. Garrison leaned forward when he talked, taking up space. Rhett sat back, arms crossed, but he was listening. He was always listening to everything. Cadden saddled a horse and rode the perimeter of the east pasture and told himself he was checking the fence line. The fence line was fine. He knew it was fine. He'd just fixed it. He rode the whole perimeter anyway. When he came back, Garrison's truck was still there. Cadden put the horse up and went to the barn to work because the barn was far enough from the bunkhouse that he couldn't see them. After about an hour, Rhett appeared in the barn doorway. "Sorry about that," Rhett said. "You don't have to apologize for having visitors," Cadden said, not looking up from what he was doing. "I know," Rhett said. "I'm apologizing for the awkward." A pause. "We dated for a while in Colorado. It ended not great." Cadden set down the harness he was working on. He turned. "Why are you telling me that?" Rhett's jaw worked. "Because I didn't want you to wonder," he said. They looked at each other. The barn was quiet. Cadden felt something move through him, something that was partly relief and partly a new kind of complication, and mostly just the dizzying sense of a door opening that he'd been keeping carefully shut. "Is he staying?" Cadden asked. The question was practical. "No," Rhett said. "He's heading to New Mexico, just passing through." He paused. "He wanted me to come with him." The air felt thinner suddenly. "Are you?" Cadden said. Rhett held his gaze. "No," he said, steady, deliberate. Cadden nodded. He picked the harness back up. "Okay," he said, and focused very hard on the leather in his hands. He heard Rhett stay in the doorway for another moment. Then he heard him leave. Cadden breathed out slowly through his nose and stared at the stitching in the harness and felt something in his chest that was reckless and terrifying and absolutely not going away. That night he sat on the porch alone. Rhett had gone back to the bunkhouse after supper, which was unusual. Maybe he needed the space. Maybe the garrison visit had stirred something up. Cadden didn't know and wasn't going to ask. He sat in the dark with a cold cup of coffee and thought about what it meant that Rhett had told him. "I didn't want you to wonder." He could have said nothing. He owed Cadden nothing, not explanations, not disclosures, not the quiet confidence of "No, I'm not leaving." He'd offered those things freely. The sky was thick with stars, the cicadas sang. Somewhere in the bunkhouse a light was on. Cadden sat there and let himself feel the full weight of what was happening inside him. He stopped managing it. He stopped trying to carry it efficiently. He just sat with it, all of it, the want and the fear and the certainty that this was the most dangerous thing that had ever happened to him, and the simultaneous certainty that he didn't want it to stop, and he let it be exactly what it was. A long time later he went to bed, and for the first time in weeks he didn't have to get through the night, he just slept. August deepened. The land moved into its late summer rhythm, the days still long and hot but carrying a thin edge of autumn in the mornings, the light shifting to something more amber and oblique. Cadden felt it in his bones the way he felt all the seasons' changes, a kind of bittersweet certainty that things were moving toward an end. The summer was ending. The arrangement was always summer. Rhett had signed on through Labor Day. He hadn't mentioned leaving. Cadden hadn't asked. It was an unacknowledged weight that had settled between them in the last weeks of August, present in every conversation without being part of any of them. What shifted everything, what made the almost into something that could no longer be contained, was a rainstorm on a Tuesday night in the last week of August. It had been a long day. They'd been working since before sunup, moving equipment before a predicted severe weather system came through. By evening they were both soaked through and exhausted, and when the rain hit in earnest it hit hard, and they ended up running for the barn the same way they had back in June. Same lantern, same horses, same rain on the roof. But nothing was the same as June. They'd settled the horses quickly. Both of them knew the animals now. Knew exactly which horse needed which kind of reassurance, and then they were standing in the center of the barn, rain hammering overhead, both of them dripping and breathing hard from the run, and the air between them was electric in a way that had nothing to do with the storm. Cadden was very still. Rhett was very still. "Rhett," Cadden said, not a question, not a statement, just his name. "Yeah," Rhett said. His voice was different, careful and full of something. Cadden started. He stopped. He took a breath. He tried again. "I don't do this well saying things." "I know," Rhett said gently. "You don't have to say." "I want to," Cadden said. "I need to." He looked at Rhett across the lantern-lit space between them. "You came here in June and I didn't want you to. I wanted things to stay exactly the way they were, manageable, contained." He paused. "And you kept being exactly who you are. You didn't ask anything of me. He stopped again, jaw tight. "You made me want things I'd gotten very good at not wanting." The silence that followed was the most alive silence Cadden had ever been in. Rhett stepped toward him, slowly, deliberately. He stopped close enough that Cadden could see the rain still caught in his eyelashes. "What kinds of things?" Rhett said very quietly. "The kind that have a cost," Cadden said, "the kind that make you vulnerable." The word cost him something to say, he felt it leave him. "The kind where if they go wrong," he exhaled, "it changes something that matters." Rhett's hand lifted. It touched Cadden's jaw just barely, just the backs of his fingers, barely a touch at all, the most tentative thing in the world. Cadden closed his eyes. "What if they don't go wrong?" Rhett said. The question hung in the air between them like something luminous. The horses shifted in their stalls, the rain fell, the lantern threw warm gold across everything. And Cadden, who did not do things halfway once he had decided to do them, opened his eyes and looked at Rhett, really looked, fully, without the walls up for the first time since the man had driven down the dirt road in June, and said, simply and quietly, "Then I don't know what I'd do." The space between them collapsed. What happened next dissolved into soft lantern light and the sound of rain on old wood, and the horses quiet in their stalls, and two people who'd spent a summer finding each other through the long and careful work of trust. It was gentle. It was warm. It was the kind of moment that the heart stores carefully in a particular place and returns to on hard days. The story fades here not because nothing more happened, but because some things are most beautiful in their privacy. What can be said is this. When the rain finally stopped, they were both still in the barn and neither of them was alone anymore, and outside the storm had cleaned the world so thoroughly that when they walked out into the wet dark and looked up, the stars were the clearest they'd been all summer. The morning after is its own kind of story. Cadden woke early the way he always did, habit and land deep in his bones, and lay still for a moment before opening his eyes. The room was pre-dawn gray, the house was quiet, everything felt exactly the same as it always did. Except it didn't, not even slightly. He lay there and let himself sit inside that fact. Last night, the barn, Rhett's hand on his face. The way things had shifted finally and completely, like a heavy door that had been stuck for 22 years simply swinging open. He wasn't afraid, he realized. He'd expected fear. He'd been bracing for the morning after fear like a man bracing for weather. But what he found instead when he took stock of himself honestly in the gray pre-dawn of his room was something that felt remarkably like stillness. He got up, made coffee, went to the porch. Rhett was already there. Of course he was already there. He was sitting on Cadden's step, their step now Cadden supposed, the step they'd ended up sharing since July with his coffee and his book, and he looked up when the screen door opened, and in the low light of early morning his expression was the same open, undefended thing it had always been, just more somehow. Warmer, closer to the surface. "Morning," he said. "Morning," Cadden said. He sat down, their arms touched, neither of them moved apart. The east pasture brightened slowly, the light coming in over the far tree line in long horizontal bands, the way Cadden had watched it come every morning of his life. He'd watched it alone, mostly. He watched it now with Rhett's shoulder warm against his and his coffee in both hands and the quiet of the land all around them, and it was the same sky it had always been and also completely different. "I'm not leaving in September," Rhett said after a while. Cadden looked at him. "I mean," Rhett paused, "if that's, I'm not assuming, I'm just," he stopped and started over. "I don't want to leave, I want to stay if you'll have me." He said it to the horizon, not to Cadden, which was somehow exactly right. Cadden was quiet for a moment. He thought about the bank letter, the East 40 acres, the $4,000 and the weight of the land and what it meant to have something to lose. He thought about all the ways this new thing could make him more vulnerable, more exposed, more breakable. And then he thought about standing at that fence post in June, alone and carrying everything, watching an unfamiliar truck come down the road. And how something in the particular quality of that morning had shifted, and he hadn't understood why until much later. "Stay," he said. One word, but it wasn't a small one. Walt found out the way Walt found out everything. He was simply paying attention. He didn't say anything for 3 days. He watched. He noticed how Cadden's body had changed, how the constant low-grade tension that had lived in Cadden's shoulders since April had loosened. He noticed that Rhett stayed for the evening coffee now, sitting with them at the kitchen table the way family does, easy and without formality. He noticed how sometimes his son glanced across the table at the ranch hand, and something quiet and unhidden moved through his face. On the third day, Walt handed Rhett a mug of the good coffee, the coffee he reserved for company he actually wanted to keep, and said, "There's a cabin on the north corner of the property. My father built it. Been empty since I was a boy. It's structurally sound, just needs work." Rhett looked at him. "Sir, you're good with your hands," Walt said. "The bunkhouse isn't comfortable in winter, the cabin would be." He sat down. I'm just observing. He picked up his newspaper. The subject apparently was closed. Cadden looked at his coffee. His jaw worked. He blinked several times. Thank you, Walt, Rhett said very quietly. Work starts at 5, Walt said behind the newspaper. They started on the cabin the second week of September, after the summer agreement had officially ended and Rhett had officially not left. They worked on it in the evenings and on weekend mornings, the two of them with tools and materials and the old structure around them. It was slow, careful work, the kind that requires patience and precision and the willingness to fix something rather than just cover it up. Cadden found the parallel not lost on him. They stripped the old wallboard and found solid bones underneath. They replaced the windows and fixed the plumbing and rebuilt the porch from scratch. They worked in the easy, efficient way they'd learned over the summer, the same wordless coordination they'd discovered in the storm and the cattle run and the everyday shared labor of the land. Sometimes Rhett sang while they worked. Old country songs and stuff Cadden still didn't recognize, and occasionally something slow and wordless that hung in the half-finished cabin like light. Cadden always listened. He didn't pretend otherwise anymore. The money situation resolved, as such things tend to, in pieces rather than all at once. Cadden talked to a credit union in the county seat, a different institution than the bank, one his grandfather had actually used before switching, and found a restructuring option he hadn't known existed. He had a hard conversation with his father about what assets they could sell without compromising the core of the operation. He sold 2 pieces of old equipment he'd been holding onto for sentimental reasons, and used the money to bring the account current. It wasn't solved, it wouldn't be solved for years, but it was manageable, which was all Cadden had ever needed. And managing it didn't feel quite so isolating now that he wasn't managing it alone. One evening, going through the paperwork at the kitchen table, he told Rhett the full shape of it. The numbers, the timeline, the forecast. He'd never said it all out loud before, not to anyone. And saying it was both harder and easier than he'd expected. Harder because the exposure was real. Easier because Rhett sat across from him and listened without fixing his face into anything, no pity, no alarm, just attention. What can I do? Rhett said when Cadden had finished. You're already doing it, Cadden said. Rhett nodded once, then he reached across the table and put his hand over Cadden's where it rested on the papers. He didn't say anything else. He didn't need to. October came in cool and clear, the sky a hard bright blue that only showed up at altitude in autumn. The leaves on the cottonwoods along the creek turned early first yellow, then a deep, burning gold, and the mornings had a clean, cold edge to them that made everything smell sharper. The horses were energetic in the way they got when the heat finally broke. The cattle were calm. The land was settling into itself. Cadden and Rhett settled into each other. It was not a dramatic thing, this settling. It was quiet and gradual and built on the same material they'd been building on all summer, work and honesty and the slow accumulation of mornings. The difference was that now the walls were down. The distance Cadden had constructed and maintained was gone, dismantled not by force but by attrition, by repeated gentle proof that the exposure was survivable, that the vulnerability didn't destroy you. That being known by someone really known was not the same as being diminished. Rhett moved into the cabin on a Saturday in late October. It wasn't finished, there was still trim work to do, and the kitchen needed proper shelving and the porch steps were waiting on materials that hadn't arrived yet. But it was warm and dry, and theirs in a way the bunkhouse had never been his. Cadden helped him carry the boxes in. There weren't many Rhett traveled light always had, but there were books. A lot of books, stacked in ways that suggested organization would be a later project. You have a reading problem, Cadden said, picking up a stack to carry inside. I prefer to think of it as a solution, Rhett said, coming through the door behind him with his arms full. Cadden set the books down on the window ledge that was serving as a temporary shelf. He looked around the cabin, the walls they'd patched and painted, the floor they'd sanded and sealed, the window light falling across everything. He thought about his grandfather building the original structure with his hands while he figured out what kind of man he was going to be. He thought about work done with care, things built to last. He felt Rhett come to stand beside him. He didn't look over, he looked at the window light. It turned out good, Rhett said. It did, Cadden agreed. A moment of quiet. Cadden. Yeah. Thank you, Rhett said, for letting me stay. Cadden looked at him then. The cabin smelled like sawdust and fresh paint and the cold October air that had come in with the boxes. Rhett's eyes were warm and direct and steady in the way they'd always been, right from the very first day, that open, undefended quality that Cadden had spent months resisting and then months discovering he couldn't live without. Thank you for not leaving, Cadden said. It wasn't maybe the most articulate declaration in the history of declarations. But Rhett smiled, the real one, the full one, the one that reached his eyes, and in the afternoon light of the cabin they'd built together, it was the only thing either of them needed. November arrived and the county threw its annual harvest dinner, a tradition larger and more attended than the July gathering, held in the community hall in town. Tables long as barn walls, food that required you to rest afterward, conversation that ran parallel and crossing like rivers. Cadden and Rhett drove in together. This was not a thing they'd discussed. Cadden had simply started the truck when it was time to go, and Rhett had walked from the cabin and gotten in, and that was that. Walt, who was riding in the back, observed this with the expression of a man who had already made his peace with something and was content to be right. In the hall, people noticed, not loudly. This was ranch country, people didn't tend to make announcements of themselves about anything. But people noticed the way they sat together, the way they moved through conversations in tandem, the way Cadden's hand briefly touched Rhett's shoulder as they passed through a crowd, and neither of them commented on it. A few people asked directly in the careful way that direct people have when they're being careful. Cadden answered those questions with a simplicity that surprised him, not with deflection or management, just yes, that's right, he's staying on. Mrs. Garrity, who had known Cadden since he was 4 years old and was not the type to pretend she hadn't noticed things, found him by the dessert table and put a hand on his arm. "You look different," she said, not critically, observationally. "Different how?" Cadden asked. She studied him for a moment. "Lighter," she said. "You were always carrying something too heavy for one person. It's good to see you not carrying it alone." Cadden looked at her and then across the room to where Rhett was standing, talking to someone he'd apparently just met, wearing that easy, open expression like he always had, like it had never cost him anything to be that available to the world. "It is," Cadden said, and meant it in every direction at once. Winter deepened across the land in the way of West Texas winters, not brutal mostly but serious. Cold mornings, clear cold days, nights that got genuinely frigid. The work changed with it. Different rhythms, different needs, feed management, water line checks, the particular quiet of a property under frost. Cadden had always liked winter. The land made sense to him in winter, stripped down to its bones, honest about what it was. No excessive green to hide behind, just the structure of things. He liked it more this year. On a clear December morning, he and Rhett rode the south fence line together, a regular check, nothing urgent. The grass was silver frosted and the horse's breath made small clouds, and the sky was the hard, brilliant blue of winter. They rode slowly, not rushing it. There was nothing to rush toward. At the south corner, where the old stone wall of Cadden's grandfather met the newer fence at a right angle, they stopped. Cadden looked at the wall the way he always did when he passed it, this rough structure of piled stone, no mortar, just the weight and fit of the pieces holding each other together. "Your grandfather's," Rhett said. "His monument to himself," Cadden said. "That's what my dad calls it, building while he figured out who he was." Rhett looked at it for a moment. "Does it bother you that he built it because he was uncertain?" "No," Cadden said, "it's still standing." He looked at Rhett. "Some things get built in uncertainty and turn out solid anyway." Rhett's eyes moved from the wall to Cadden. The horses shifted beneath them. The winter morning was quiet and clean and cold. "Yeah," Rhett said, "they do. There are things that belong to particular places. Not just objects, not just the stone wall or the old barn or the grandfather's handwriting in the ledger books Cadden kept in the house, but feelings. Truths. The kind that could only be arrived at in one specific geography by one specific road." Cadden thought about this often in those winter months. About the particular shape of what had happened to him on this land. About how different it might have gone, how easy it would have been to remain in the managed, contained version of himself, to keep the walls up, to let the summer end and the handshake happen and the beat-up blue truck disappear back down the dirt road. He thought about what he had chosen instead, not loudly or dramatically, quietly, the way all the best choices get made in small moments across the accumulated weight of a season. Walt's back was improving, slowly. He'd started walking without the cane on good days, and on those days he had more energy and less temper, which improved everything in the household. He and Rhett had developed something that Cadden could only describe as a rapport, not warm exactly, not in the explicit way, but functional and grounded in mutual respect. Walt gave orders the same way he always had, direct and without decoration, and Rhett followed them with the same steady competence, and between those two constants something had grown that was recognizably trust. One evening Cadden overheard them from the hallway, Walt and Rhett at the kitchen table, talking about fence maintenance. Just that. The technical particulars of fence post depth in the kind of soil they had on the east boundary. The conversation was completely ordinary and completely warm, and it made Cadden stop in the hallway and stand still for a moment. He was not alone, he had not been alone for months. But sometimes it still surprised him, the depth of that fact. The new year came in without ceremony, the way New Year's do on working land. January 1st looked exactly like December 31st, required the same things, didn't wait. Cadden was up at 5, Rhett was in the barn, Walt was at the kitchen table with his coffee. The world had not rearranged itself, but the three of them inside it had. Over those winter months, Cadden and Rhett had built something that had no particular name, but that structured the days like good architecture, present everywhere, invisible until you needed it. It was the cup of coffee that appeared on the fence post when Cadden was working and hadn't realized he was cold. It was the evening conversation that turned into 2 hours without trying. It was the way Rhett always knew which horse needed which kind of attention, and how that knowledge was an act of caring so embedded in the daily work that it would have been invisible to anyone who wasn't paying close attention. Cadden was paying close attention. One night in January, they were in the cabin, Rhett's cabin, finished now, proper and warm and full of books, and the wind was going hard outside, one of those whistling, lateral cold fronts that raked across the flat land without mercy. Cadden had meant to go back to the house an hour before, but the wind had gotten worse and the cabin was warm and neither of them had pushed the issue. Rhett was reading. Cadden was doing nothing, which was unusual for him. He generally needed to be doing something with his hands. But tonight he was just sitting in the chair across from Rhett, in the warm light, listening to the wind do its work outside, and he realized with a quiet surprise, simply at rest. Fully at rest, not managing, not carrying, not watching the edges. Just here in this room with this person. Rhett looked up from his book at some point, the way you look up when you feel someone's attention. He found Cadden looking at him with an expression that had nothing hidden in it, just whatever it was, fully visible. "What?" Rhett said softly. "Nothing," Cadden said. "I'm just," he paused. "Happy," he said. The word felt strange in his mouth, like a word in a language he was still learning. "I'm just happy." Rhett's face did something Cadden had no words for. He set the book down slowly. He said in the quiet voice that had been finding its way through all of Cadden's walls since June, "Yeah, me too." The wind shook the windows. The lamp burned steadily. Outside, the snow that had been threatening for days finally started to come down, light and determined. They stayed in the warm room and let it fall. Spring came the way it always came to that land, tentatively at first, then all at once. The creek rose with snowmelt from the distant mountains. The grass came up green in places it had been brown since November. The horses grew restless and the cattle moved differently, and the whole property seemed to take a long breath and release it. On the first morning in March that felt genuinely warm, 55 degrees, soft wind, the smell of the ground waking up, Cadden and Rhett rode the full property perimeter together. Not a task, not a check, just the ride, just the land. They didn't talk much. They didn't need to. The horses walked at an easy pace and the sun was warming their backs, and the property opened up around them in that immense, specific way that it always had, the 500 acres that Cadden had been born knowing, that was threaded through every cell of him, that he had almost lost and had not, that was still here. That was still his. That was now, quietly, also home to something else. Something that had arrived in a beat-up blue truck one June morning and had not left. At the south corner at the grandfather's stone wall, they stopped again, the way they always stopped there. "I've been thinking," Rhett said. "Dangerous," Cadden said. Rhett glanced at him. "I want to stay," he said, "not just through spring. He paused, gathered himself. This was a man who was usually easy with words, but not right now, not for this. "I want to build something here with you, not just the cabin, I mean the whole thing, the ranch, the life." He looked at Cadden steadily. "I know that's a big thing to say." "It is," Cadden agreed. "I know the land is complicated, the finances, I know it's not settled." "It's not." "I'm not coming to you with my hands empty," Rhett said. "I have savings, enough to matter. I've been thinking about it since November. I could invest, be a real part of this." He stopped. "If you want that." Cadden looked at the stone wall, his grandfather's monument to himself built in uncertainty still standing. You know what my grandfather found out, Cadden said, when he was building that wall.
What?
That the point was never the wall, Cadden said. The wall was just the work he did while he figured out that this was where he was supposed to be. He looked at Rhett. I think this is where you're supposed to be. Rhett's throat moved. I think so too, he said. They rode back across the spring land in the growing warmth of the morning, side by side across the green going grass, the horses walking easy, the sky wide and clear and full of light. Behind them the stone wall stood, as it had for 60 years, as it would for 60 more. Ahead of them the barn and the house and the cabin, the land they both knew now in different ways and with different histories as theirs. The work was not done, the money situation was not solved. The land still needed what land always needs: constant attention, constant care, the kind of love that expresses itself in showing up every single day. It would need all of that for as long as they were on it. But they were on it together. That was the thing. Epilogue: What the summer started. There is a certain kind of story that doesn't have a neat ending because life doesn't work that way and the best love stories know it. This story doesn't end with a ribbon on it. It ends with two men on a working ranch in West Texas on a March morning with everything still ahead of them. The hard years and the good ones, the problems that will come the way they always come, and the particular deep comfort of facing them beside someone who has chosen, quietly and with full understanding of the cost, to stay. It ends with coffee on the porch steps. It ends with Rhett's shoulder warm against Cadden's and the east pasture brightening, and the whole complicated beautiful machinery of the land beginning another day. It ends with Cadden, who spent 22 years perfecting the art of carrying things alone, setting something down. Not the land, not the responsibility, not the care or the work or the love that runs through all of those things like a seam through rock. Just the alone. He set that down. He is not sorry. There is a morning, it is no particular morning, or it is every morning, it doesn't matter, where Cadden is standing at the fence post at the edge of the east pasture and Rhett comes up beside him and doesn't say anything, just stands there with his coffee, looking at the same horizon. And Cadden, who did not grow up knowing how to name what he felt, who learned the language of the land before the language of his own heart, who spent a summer trying to stay at the managed, safe distance from a man who showed up every morning and simply refused to be excluded from his attention. Cadden turns and looks at Rhett. Rhett turns and looks at him. And whatever is there between them, warm and weathered and built from 100 ordinary mornings and one extraordinary summer and all the honest miles in between, is so completely itself, so fully arrived, that neither of them needs to say a single word. The sun comes up over